The story time I'm about to share with you is in the top 3 most unsettling emails I've received since starting Spooky Scary Storytime. It came from an ecologist who claims that his superior, his boss, was not of the human race. You can skip to this part if you want to start the story right now, but I feel like there's a few disclaimers that I have to get off my chest before I start this story. First off, I'm only going to tell you what he said in the email. I'm not going to inject my own opinion because we listen, we don't judge. Second of all, he does not follow me, but his daughter is a fan of Spooky Scary Storytime, which is how he found me and why he submitted his story. Apparently, she's been following very closely the Diorb bags videos, and she thought that this was relevant somehow to what's going on. The Dior bags is a whole nother rabbit hole, so go down that if you haven't. But third, this man sent me this email from his real name. He asked me to please keep him anonymous because his career is on the line, which is why he's never told this story publicly. He said he's very well respected in an academic and professional sense. Literally the reason I get the good stories is because I respect people's anonymity. Finally, before I start the story, I'm going to censor certain words because media in general does censor a little bit certain things. So you're going to have to fill in some blanks, but I will try to make them as clear and concise as possible. This man said I could refer to him as Dr. Corbin. He's been an ecologist for the last 20 years. He is extremely well respected. He has published papers. He has contributed to scientific journals. He's a big deal. Sometime in the last 20 years, he was doing a research expedition at Yasuni National Park in Ecuador. It is part of the Amazon rainforest, and he said it's extremely unique in that it's one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, and it has extremely unique climatic conditions. To put it simply, he was there to study biodiversity. He said these research expeditions usually last anywhere from a few weeks to a few months, but this specific expedition was 8 weeks, and he was there with a few people that he knew, but it was a relatively large team. One of the guys he's there with, he went to school with to get his PhD, and he knew him relatively well. He said that this man had never said anything about like fringe theories, like he was very scientific minded. He said his entire team was working under the supervision and hand of somebody named Dr. Vola, not her real name. He had never met Dr. Vola, but she communicated with them pretty much just through email, and a few of his bosses that were on site knew her. His friend who he went to school with had also met Dr. Vola on a previous project. So after 2 weeks, when the team was there, Dr. Vola was coming out to the station where they were all staying. And the night before she gets there, Dr. Corbin is asking Dr. Joe, like what's she like, like what's she like working with? And Dr. Joe just says point blank to him, she's a lizard. Not what he said, but you know what I'm saying. He said there was no sense of like sarcasm, of like joking in his voice. So Dr. Corbin's like, what do you mean she's a lizard? And Dr. Joe is like, yeah, like you'll see when you meet her, like everyone knows, everyone accepts it, but that's just what she is. Dr. Corbin obviously thinks he's joking and doesn't take him seriously because, again, he had known Dr. Joe since they were in school, and Dr. Joe had never exhibited any, like, conspiracy theorist tendencies. He had never said anything like that before, so he's like, obviously he's messing with me. Dr. Corbin said at this point in his email that he's experienced a lot of strange things that he can't explain in his work. He's experienced weird animal noises, weird animal behaviors, weird noises in the jungle, weird lights in the sky, but nothing could have prepared him for meeting Dr. Vola. She arrives the next day. He said the first thing he noticed about her was her complexion was one of the things that made her beautiful. He said it was like glass. Like, he didn't know the words then because this was before social media, but he said it was like she was wearing a filter in real life. But he wasn't trying to flirt with her. Obviously, she was his boss. He was actually intimidated by her because not only was she stunning, but she was incredibly smart, and she appeared to be a lot younger than him, even though he was relatively young when this happened. He said that was surprising to him because when she arrived on site, he expected some respected doctor that had been in the field for 20 or 30 years. When she gets there, she basically doesn't interact with anyone, but she gives people certain assignments. And he said the second thing he noticed was her movements. They were almost too smooth, like they were calculated. Like she was trying to figure out a way to fit in naturally with other people she was around. The day after she arrives, her and the team venture out into the jungle. They're working on something. And he said he noticed that her skin was weird in the sunlight, like it was almost reflective. But then he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. It was so hot. And then he realized she wasn't sweating. So he started paying attention to it the next few days. She never had a bead of sweat anywhere on her. Every night the team ate together. She would always remove herself from the situation. She never ate with the team. She never had a snack. She claimed that she had certain allergy restrictions that prevented her from eating normal food. Not that weird, but what was weird to Dr. Corbin was that she always seemed to be near animals in their final moments. Dr. Corbin said he really didn't recognize it at first because in the rainforest, creatures succumb all the time to predation, illness, or just the elements of the rainforest. But after about a week, her proximity to their final moments became too obvious and too frequent to ignore. In one case, he said they were tracking a giant anteater for a few weeks. It was an elder male, it was scarred, it was majestic, and they had been monitoring its activity for a few weeks. One night, their GPS tracker on the giant anteater stopped tracking. It was later in the afternoon, but it was still light out, so Dr. Corbin and a few of his colleagues went out to find it. And they come to it, and they see Dr. Vola crouched over it. Her face is almost touching it, but when she saw them, she stood up and straightened herself. She muttered something about checking for signs of it being attacked by a predator, but the team took samples and they concluded that it had passed from natural causes. But what struck Dr. Corbin was Dr. Vola's behavior later that night. She seemed energized. She seemed like she was invigorated by something. He said when they returned to the base, her movements were sharper and quicker, like she had just had a surge of adrenaline. It wasn't just the anteater. After that, he noticed if something was dying, she was there. It was birds, frogs, small mammals, and every time she seemed to have a surge of energy afterward, like she fed off of it. He said obviously he has no way to prove it, but he felt like she was feeding off of something, their life force, their distress. He said over the next few weeks, Dr. Vola spoke very little, but when she did, she seemed to reveal information that she couldn't have possibly known. The results of experiments before they had concluded, the location of animals before they looked at the tracker. One evening, he decides he's going to joke with her. He's like, Dr. Vola, you are psychic, or you have a satellite feed in your brain. He said that her reaction stunned him. She stopped what she was doing, stared him dead in the eyes, unblinking, and said, Dr. Corbin, jokes are dangerous, and you don't want to ask questions with answers that you can't live with. He laughed nervously, but she just turned and walked away, and later that night, she approached him when he was alone. She asked him if he knows how fragile humans are and how easily they can fall apart. Then she tells him that the jungle respects strength, not fragility, and honesty, not jokes. Dr. Corbin said his breaking point on this project came a few weeks later. He was watching the night trail cams and he spotted something odd in the trees. It was about human size, but it moved like a reptile. It had reflective eyes and it moved with a speed unbeknownst to him. He said at this point in his career he was very familiar with most of the species that lived in the rainforest and he had no idea what this was. The timestamp the video showed was during one of Dr. Vola's solo patrols. The next morning he confronts her and he tells her basically like, I think the light or the camera messed up because like look at what I found. And she watches the footage and she looks at him and she says, delete it. And he was like, I don't know what it is. Like, look at the elongated neck. I think we should study this. Like, we should try to find whatever this is. And she leans in closer and she says, delete it. He tells her he would, but he didn't. And then later that day when he checked his laptop, the footage was gone. A few weeks later, the project concluded and he went home. He's back in the US now and he has not worked with Dr. Vola since, but he said he believes that some things walk among us that are not human, even if they appear to be. I'm genuinely curious your thoughts on this. Please let me know what you think, if you know what this was, if you believe that she really was a lizard, or if you think he's full of it. Dr. Corbin, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really enjoyed this story, even though it is unsettling to me, because I always am impressed or taken aback whenever I receive a story that's from someone who is from a walk of life that I would never experience. Everybody else keeps sending me your spooky, weird, things you think that no one would believe stories, and I will keep adding them to this playlist.